Hey, everybody. This is Adam Cornish and Paul Harrison for Agricultural Advocates. It's April 17th, Friday. And what are we going to get up to today, Paul?
I think we're going to talk a little bit about the H-2A visa developments and what's going on there, which is a interesting topic of conversation for folks in the ag sector. I think we should also touch base or have a little discussion here on the World Food Prize winner, who is a pretty interesting individual, and I think good advocate for biotechnology. And then I wanted to just touch a little bit on some developments this morning, which just came up on some new developments where the Iranians are opening up the Strait of Hormuz, which I think is got some good developments for U.S. agriculture potentially.
Yeah. So it's completely open. I know there were all this conversation about we're going to have to pay this amount or we're going to have to pay that amount for things to go through the strait. Is it so it's just completely open? Everybody's allowed to go through their
Apparently,
preferences?
everybody's allowed to go through. That's what the Iranians are saying, right? So they've opened it up, and they are requiring coordination, whatever that entails.
Hmm.
Details are sketchy. All details are always sketchy here.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, I mean, it just happened. So we're
It
going to
just happened.
expect things to get super easy for farmers right away, right?
I don't think you can expect that to happen quickly, but, prices go up quickly on things like natural gas and oil. They are dropping right now, but I think it'll be a little while before we see some impact. There's I think there's like 900,000 over 900,000 tons of fertilizer, so like urea, ammonia,
Hmm.
phosphate stuck in the Gulf, right? So it'll be helpful to get that flowing. Certainly there's millions and millions, tens of millions of barrels of oil that are stuck in the Gulf. Be helpful to get that stuff out. I would note that just yesterday I saw the report of how most of the super tankers, right, the ones that can carry like 2 million barrels at a time, had started heading to US ports to load in the US. So they're probably going to have to do U-turns now. Logistics is always there's always stuff in motion, right? So where are the tankers at and how quickly can they get to the Gulf? How quickly do people want to take the risk? I think it all depends on the ceasefire in Israel or between
Yeah.
Israel and Lebanon, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and so that's always a tenuous situation between Israel and Hezbollah, right? So
So
I would hope
a
one
question I
doesn't.
have is, do you know if there were if because I know when we had blockages in the past, folks would actually choose to go around the Horn of Africa. It's like we got to get these things back and forth rather than just waiting in line. Did
Right.
we have any of that going on, or do you not know?
Well, I mean, they just haven't been able to get stuff out of the Gulf, right? So,
Mm,
except for some Saudi oil that's loaded from that terminal in the Red Sea. Um, This is it's gonna take months to fix
hmm.
stuff. So it's gonna take years to fix some of the damage, like the gas field in Kuwait or Qatar that got hit, right? So a lot of this is just gonna take a long time to unravel. But what's gonna matter is how the ceasefire holds. I think certainly the United States and Iran have an interest in seeing, trade flow and the straits open, right?
Hmm.
Iran wants to access world markets easily. The US blockade has made that hard. I think if they're able to do that and sell their oil, that's positive for them. Certainly, if their ceasefire holds in Lebanon, that's good for them. Those are things they want. We want the straits open, and so I think both sides, even though there's negotiations supposedly going to go on Sunday in Pakistan again, both sides don't really have an interest in going back to hostilities, right? I think we reached the extent of what we can do from the air. Um,
Mm.
both sides have seen that, and so I think we're probably going to just keep finding a way to move forward.
All right. What does success look like for our farmers, though, in the near future?
I think for farmers, there's a positive here. Um, if the fertilizer's flowing, that'll reduce prices over time, right? Maybe not necessarily in time for the spring planting season, but certainly going forward. So looking at 2027. Um, so hopefully there's some relief for them, but I think you've seen some of the charts. A lot of farmers didn't have all the fertilizer they needed,
Hmm.
so that may not be the relief or immediate relief that we would like to see. I think we will see fuel prices come down if all of this holds, right? That's a big if. And so that would be good, and that would be more immediate because oil's dropped by 10, 15% already today, so it's starting to show some real drops there. I think on the other side, the US dollar is dropping,
Mm.
because folks aren't seeking a safe haven asset at the moment, right? That idea that conflict is going to keep going on, and thus you need to find safe haven assets. People are going to be more open to other types of assets and investments, and so the US dollar is dropping. That's always a positive for US agricultural exports, right? Because it makes them more competitive. globally. Corn was already at near record highs, if not record highs on exports. Soybeans are really, really low, right? We're touching bottom for the last 10 or 15 years. And so hopefully that'll be able to pick up because hopefully we'll be more competitive. Um, but all of this depends on the ceasefire holding. I think there's a lot of words that come out of the administration and the Iranians. We're not really sure. A lot of good, things you want to hear, but then you've got to see the action. We've seen the action now with the Strait opening back up. We'll
Hmm.
see what the US is doing on that. And if we're just going to, go into a period where we don't necessarily resolve everything with Iran, but we just kind of at a status quo for a while. So, but if the straits are open, that's positive for everybody.
Exactly. So we'll continue to monitor this and see, what the actual downstream impacts are going to be now into the future. Um,
Absolutely.
I- I'd love
So,
to go ahead.
well, I was going to say, I think that's pretty much exhausted that. I think it emphasizes the fact that you always need people who understand various forces in the world and how they're shaping things and influence you, and how a lot of statements get made. I mean, you hear the president say a lot of stuff, right? Then you got to see the action, right? And how do you decipher all the various statements and actions to see what's actually going to happen, right? So you need folks who have some of that international experience, and that's what we'd like to provide to folks. But I did think some of the topics that we were planning to talk about before the Iranians jumped us here and opened up the straits, would be also of interest to folks. And so I didn't know if you want to start with World Food Prize next, which is always a favorite topic, or if you wanted to go and talk about the H-2A visa.
Let's talk a little bit about World Food Prize.
Okay.
So, as I previewed on our last episode, Huub Lelieveld, which I apologize for butchering that name, is a Dutch food scientist who was recently awarded the 2026 World Food Prize, or he's going to be awarded. I'm never quite sure about the process. They have an announcement, and then in October in Des Moines, they actually have
He's
the
announced.
full event, and he's actually given the award. Um, so just where he's really had an impact is in the world of food safety. He started a number of years ago something called the Global Harmonization Initiative, also known as GHI, which basically is serving as an advocacy group to harmonize and streamline regulations related to food safety. I think this largely grew out of famine conditions in South Africa, I believe in 2002, where South Africa was the recipient of grain and other food aid from a variety of nations, but there were concerns along the way as the food comes in, it still needs to be checked. If I'm hungry, I would love food, but I'm not going to take a case of rotten bananas to get there. Right? It's not going to it's going to be counterproductive, and so um, the an issue that can be run into is that national competent authorities, regulators, don't necessarily always agree with each other on exactly how to evaluate products. And so, looking at this, he realized how detrimental it really was in communicating food aid across borders, to have regulators not be able to talk to each other in an effective way.
Mhm.
Um, and that's one of the main goals of GHI. So that's been absolutely foundational and fundamental in uh, achieving some of these harmonization goals. Um, Talking about some of the kind of fun things about him, um, is he actually started in a chili sauce factory. His father ran this
In the
factory.
Netherlands?
Yeah, yeah, that they make chili sauce
Didn't
too.
know they did chili sauce.
Yeah, it's not, not a
European food is not spicy.
didn't say that the chili was spicy, just that it
Mm,
existed.
good point. Good
So
point.
he started there and was actually very interested in the mechanics of it all. So rather than focusing on the food itself, it was about how do you make the processes better. And this actually kind of led him to his educational training, which was in electrical engineering at The Hague. And so it's great because he started with a light food background, moved into a products systems engineering space, and then took that training forward with him when he was actually addressing food safety concerns. I just think that's
Yeah,
absolutely
it's pretty
fantastic.
interesting. Yeah.
Um, and he one thing as I was doing some research on him that I learned is that he has an ethical framework called, and it's a terrible name in my opinion, but P3FC, which the three P's are people, planet, and prosperity, and then the food chain. And I think
Hmm.
it's these are all interconnected and important components where really you center people at the basis of your ethical framework. You consider the planet because we need to have a thriving ecosystem for our agricultural systems to exist within. But then this um we always have to put it into the framework of prosperity because we can focus on people and their safety and their health. We can focus on the environment and what our practices are doing to it. But at the end of the day, if as a community and as a culture we aren't thriving, then we miss out, and you're not going to be able to get folks to buy into that framework. So I really appreciate that. That's kind of his moral underpinning and his approach to addressing food safety concerns. So you're trying to hit all three of these things at the same time.
Fascinating. So, it's always interesting to me who they select to be the winners, right? I mean,
Hmm.
Yoon was just is an amazing individual, right? And then she was the first one that I met there, and then the last couple of ones have been fascinating as well, right? Last year's winner, her research in crops is just amazing. So this food safety aspect of it, I think, is one that we don't. Necessarily think about enough, right? I think we take food safety for granted in the United States often, right? Because we're able to, right? We have
Hmm.
USDA, which and the various elements of it, which do such a good job of ensuring food safety. We have large recalls from time to time, but that's because the system works, right? And because they flag it and enforce, action on producers. So a lot of the world just doesn't benefit from that, but I think it shows really the importance of of global standards that are agreed to and can be met, right? And then that facilitates so much, in terms of US exports and trade, right? It's beneficial to all of us. So fascinating that he's done this. I look forward to maybe getting to meet him in the fall.
Well, that'd be
And
great.
that is an event,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The World Food Prize, the week-long seminars, everything that is a
Yeah,
fantastic
one
event.
and everyone that's coming together that really cares about these topics.
Yeah.
You're talking about, the US. I like to say that we often have the gold standard in terms of food safety, right? Our FDA is absolutely fantastic. Um, and being able to share that with the world, to be able to address food safety regulatory approaches, and try to make sure that we're all sitting on the same field, takes a lot of work. And that's something that the US has actually been a standard bearer for decades at this point. The two
Mhm.
organizations I typically think of are the Codex Alimentarius, which is a co-venture between the UN Food and Agriculture Organization and then the WHO, um, where the U.S. has sat there and helped develop global standards for food safety that other countries can then try to uh, reach to, and have at least the same standard of
Mhm.
safety approaches. I also think about the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where a lot of technical documentation can actually be co-developed between different OECD countries, which can then serve as the basis for safety assessments and regulatory frameworks. Um, I think the the part that makes me most sad about the last few years is that we're seeing less engagement from the U.S. in these organizations.
Yeah.
If only from the standard point of reduced international travel by federal employees. As we've stated before, you and I are both former State Department officials. Um, as we were ending our tenure, we saw travel funding for the State Department travel going down, right? Um, and I've seen it with friends and colleagues and other agencies as well. Um, there was a recent OECD meeting where literally the only person that attended was a member of state. And the
Mhm.
USDA, FDA colleagues that are really necessary to drive these conversations, they just weren't given the funding. They weren't given the approval.
Yeah,
And what this represents is a step back from the US being able to influence those conversations. And it has a twofold impact. Um, we're no longer able to kind of help show that gold standard and bring it to the international stage. But it also means that the decisions that are being made may countervail U.S. interests, right? Because
absolutely. You gotta
if
be
the
there to fight the fight.
standards change, if the practices change, they may no longer align with the way the U.S. conducts our trade practice. And
Right.
suddenly, a place that was a happy port to call for our products may no longer. And so, I think it's
Exactly.
important that uh, we really shine a light on the fact that the U.S. needs to be in the room, so that we can be part of the conversation.
Yeah, and I think farmers, trade associations, they all understand that, right?
Hmm.
If we're not there engaged in those fights and those arguments and those discussions in that decision-making process, then it's harder for US farmers to export and find new markets, right? And to service the markets they already have because the world will move on without us, right?
Exactly.
You've got to be there. You see this all across the spectrum, right? From sustainable aviation fuel to maritime diesel to biotechnology and acceptance to food and safety, all of it, right? The world's going to set standards, right? Um, you can fight the fight to get every country one by one to accept yours, and waste a tremendous amount of time.
On a
Um,
limited term basis too.
yeah, on a very and for a limited outcome, right? Or you can go and fight the fight at the WTO, SPS, at Codex Alimentarius, as we've seen, and be successful, right? And then you've got everybody to buy in. I always thought it was fascinating the number of countries that lack the infrastructure the United States has. So they don't have an FDA, don't have USDA type elements, right? They don't have those experts. They might have one or two experts, literally, some of these
Mhm,
smaller countries, right? And they just say, well, what does Codex say? That's what we
mhm.
do. What does WTO SPS say? That's what we do. Okay. We're going to do that. Right. Great. Okay. When you know that that's the case and that they just accept that standard and you can meet that standard, then you're good. Right. So, anyway, I always love those kind of discussions and the advocacy. And it is, every time I go out to Iowa, Illinois, Texas, wherever, right, the farmers get it, right? The sorghum farmers out in West Texas know they need to meet international standards to be able to export, the half of their crop that goes into international trade, which is where their profit lies, right? So, um, I just always love those discussions because there's always seems to be a disconnect, right, on the policymaker side, right? The people who get into positions in government. It doesn't matter administration, right? It just doesn't matter, right? There's often a disconnect where they're like, well, why does that matter? Oh, the farmer gets it and the trade association gets it, right? So we just got to make sure everybody else gets it too, right? In the decision making process. All right.
Well, I mean,
So
we're talking about
anything else you want
decision-making
to know?
processes, so, I think that's actually a really good, segue to talk about H-2B visas. So,
Yeah, let's do that. I
yeah.
have not done any visa work for over 20 years, but I did a lot of it at one
Yeah.
point in time.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think you probably followed some of these stories. So one thing I'll note is that just last year there were 400,000 H-2B visas that were granted. This is like at least a 20-fold increase over what we had 20 years ago.
Yep.
Where's this coming from, Paul? Why do we need so many of these visas coming through? And yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like in the agricultural sector, is specifically, you've got people who are willing to do the work that Americans aren't willing to do. Right. I've I've picked a lot of crops. I grew up on a hobby farm in Southern Illinois. Not necessarily fun, right? Not the kind of thing you get a lot of Americans do. And we've transitioned more to a service economy, right? And we're much more efficient with our use of mechanization and everything. But there's just dairy industry cows got to get milked, right? So you need people to come in and do that work, and it is hard to find people. And so you end up relying on the H2A visas. And so that's what drives a lot of it, right? We have needs. On the other end of the spectrum, we need a lot of highly skilled people to come in here because we don't produce enough. We've got a strong economy, but we don't produce enough for the people that, with the skills that we need. So, until we do, we're going to rely on folks coming in from overseas. And then, there's always the immigration aspect too, right? On some of those really highly skilled folks, don't we want to recruit people who are, exceptionally talented engineers from around the world,
Hmm.
folks like that? So, you know, that's how we stay ahead of the competition.
Yeah. I'll note that in this particular case, I believe H2A is more related to bringing in, worker labor. And recently, the Trump administration, in an attempt to reduce the complexity of the system, has actually been taking definitive steps to do so. Part of which actually involves reducing the minimum pay for workers on H2A visas. Um, and so they're catching a lot of flack for that. Where
Yeah, I
they're
bet.
seeing it on both sides of the aisle, where you're looking at civil rights groups that are essentially saying that this is unfair to the workers because they're receiving even less than they've received in the past, and this is going to impact them in terms of the money that they're able to send home, and it's not fair for the labor that they're actually conducting. Then you see other groups, especially anti-immigration groups, that are saying that this is unfair to American workers by reducing the um, salary floor. Essentially, this means that there's going to be an influx of H2B visa holders, and that this even if an American wanted to compete for these jobs, they can't. It's not sustainable to live off of $5 an hour, right?
Yeah.
So, it seems like the administration is kind of stuck, because they recognize the need for this labor, the importance of the labor, reducing the complexity for our farmers, but any actions that they take, they're basically being dinged on. Well, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, the administration's stuck, but every administration's been stuck with this, right? This is a long-standing debate of trying to balance between U.S. domestic labor, interests, human rights, all need for labor, right? All these things, right? And there's no easy solution on this. But if we're going to bring people into the country, you can't bring them in and pay them so little that they are in poverty, essentially. Um, you need some reform, some structure, certainly, to this program.
Mhm.
Um, where it all ends up, I mean, it's got to end up in some place where you can bring in labor that you need that doesn't undermine U.S. producer or U.S. Workers. But in a lot of cases, there aren't U.S. workers, right?
Yeah.
There aren't people who want to come and work in agriculture, especially in a short time, right? When I was a kid growing up in Southern Illinois, the migrant workers would come through, and they would spend a month, and then they were moving on, right? They were coming from the south as the things were getting harvested further south, and they were moving north as things were getting harvested. And then at the end of the season, you'd see them pass back through, right, as they were headed back to Mexico or wherever they come from, right?
Mm,
Uh, but those people came for a short period of time. They worked the orchards, right? We had an orchard across the street from our house,
mhm,
right? And you'd see scores of them working in the orchard, doing the harvest, right? And then they move on. Um, those programs can be beneficial to encouraging folks to remain in their home country by giving them a chance to work for sufficient wages in the United States that they can, sustain their standard of living and their families back home. A lot of folks don't necessarily want to come here and stay, right?
mhm,
They're glad to have a means of making a living and then going back home and staying there. We've had programs that were successful in that regard in the past. We probably need to look at some of those and see what we can, you know, take the best elements of that. It's been a long time since I dealt with visa laws, right, and the whole immigration and non-immigrant uh, scheme of things. It is overly complex,
mm,
right? It is drives you crazy, right, with how complicated it is on various schemes, right? And there's always a new visa category because they thought, oh, we need some. We don't need 50, 60, however many different categories we have, right? We don't need J1s, 2s, and Ks and Ls and all these various visa types, right? We need a much more limited system that meets the needs of the United States. So I think the administration is right to try to reform it, but you've got to ensure that the people that you bring in aren't exploited to, uh, you know, that undermines us in
Mhm.
the long term,
Yeah.
right? What we need is something that gives people a fair shake and helps our economy. You don't do that by exploiting people. So
Mhm.
that's I certainly get where some of the human rights folks are coming from. So
Yeah.
that's
It's
probably
a
enough for me on that topic, of which I
I
am no longer an expert.
I mean, I'll listen to you talk about it for forever. The things I'll just point out is, like, um, you mentioned, advanced, machinery, and so we are reducing costs in some ways for picking crops, but those are for row crops. Those are for things that are easy to get to. You mentioned the orchards. That's
Yeah,
where orchards, specialty crops, that's where, um, immigrant labor is really, often essential. You,
yeah. How do you teach a yeah? How do you pick tomatoes
you know,
right
hey,
at the right time?
drones are gonna get us there. No, the drones, there's also the
You
use
joke
of.
about drones, but have you seen? And I joke about drones too, right? But have you seen? Not a drone, but there's a humanoid robot. A Chinese company makes it. There's a video clip of from Poland of one of these humanoid drones chasing some wild boars out of a town.
Yeah.
I just saw it yesterday. It's first off, it's hilarious, right? Because
Mhm.
I've lived in like Berlin, right? The wild boars are everywhere, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, that's very common sight. But this robot chasing them and like clearing a curb as it runs after them slowly, but
Yeah.
runs after them, right? And scares them off. Hey, I think you put enough visual optics on that robot can learn to pick the tomato when it's ripe, or the apple, or the peach, or whatever. So,
Potentially.
I mean,
It's
it,
a it's
I
it's an
was
open
surprised
question.
by
I
how
don't know if
cool
we're
it
gonna get that'll also be a price point thing where, is the technology cheap enough for a specialty farmer to be able to afford? Let's note, specialty farmers are already living on extremely razor thin margins. Um,
right, but it's like 9 grand for the robot.
I'll believe. How about this, Paul? That's next episode. You tell us more about that.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to check that out,
One thing
man.
I can talk about on the next episode very briefly is, like you mentioned, tomatoes. We can have easier picked tomatoes using genetic engineering, where instead of being a clustered, like vines that go everywhere, it's a single line, it goes along a predetermined route, and it can be picked more easily.
Yep.
But in terms of these visas, it's a complex problem. You pointed out that, there's so many different kinds of visas. Um, there's probably some reason that it exists. I don't really know, but these visas are important, and we're that's not going to change anytime in the near future. So I'm uh I think what the focus really needs to be on, how can we be helping farmers get that labor, and how that labor can be best, that the folks that are doing the labor be treated the most effectively.
Right.
Um, Last piece for us today, I think, is USDA DepSec just last week talked about there's issues with phosphate prices at the moment, especially the amount of phosphate that's actually being produced for fertilizer. And you specifically called out Mosaic. Um, Essentially, Mosaic has reduced the amount of phosphate that's producing, and this is going to have a direct impact on North American farmers, especially as there are high tariffs on phosphate coming from Morocco and Russia.
Mhm.
So, uh, where uh, where are we sitting on this right now? What are farmers to do?
So I think farmers probably need to make the case with their elected representative, and anybody else who'll listen, that the US needs more competition,
Mm,
right? Um, Farmers certainly are facing competition, right? They face
mhm,
it from Brazil, Argentina, um, other places as well for their row crops, or for specialty crops as well, right? There's a lot of competition. Um, but when you move up the chain in agriculture, right, you've got a more limited number of producers, suppliers, and processors, right? And that impacts the farmers, right? It has a real impact on farmers' bottom line because they get squeezed on input costs when there's not enough competition among the input supplier. and they get squeezed when they sell because there's only so many processors to buy their product, right? I think the solution is more competition,
Mhm.
across the spectrum in the United States, right? Not that I don't love, all the producers and, the input suppliers and the processors and all, but we just need more competition, right? We've consolidated a lot,
Mm.
and that has resulted in, not monopolies, but, situations where you have concentrated, decision-making power on the markets, right?
Yeah.
On both sides, and so the farmers get squeezed on that, right? And their margins go down. Um,
What
if
can
we
the
remove
US can do for that? Like, how are we going to create more
Yeah, so you see
competition? It
USDA, I haven't looked deeply into it. We saw that Secretary Rollins was talking about means to boost, domestic production of fertilizer,
Mm,
right? So you could incentivize production of fertilizer by new companies, right?
mm,
You could work with some of the startups that have arisen. I saw Monarch was bought out by John Deere the other day. It's a tractor maker, self-driving tractor.
mm,
John Deere does a really cool, self-driving tractor, so you can see why they purchased Monarch, right? But Monarch didn't succeed on its own,
mm,
right? But ensuring maybe that some of those startups get a better chance to succeed on their own, would be very helpful because it creates competition, right? Um, those kind of things that the government could do, right? It's not well, I would say not picking winners and losers, but the government's been picking winners and losers under this administration and chips and other things, right? So you've seen a lot of that. Um, Agriculture is a critical supply chain, right?
mhm,
So we need to ensure that we've got enough entities for our national security and that we've got enough competition so that farmers aren't squeezed on the margins on both sides so that, we've got a healthy farm economy as well. It's
mhm,
important for us. And so I think, promoting means of production, on the input side and then, ensuring that there's sufficient processors, competition amongst processors,
mhm.
um, to ensure that the farmers can, shop around and get a better deal. I think that'd be helpful,
Yeah,
to our overall farm economy, right? It's not about cutting back, the shareholders on either end of the spectrum there, and taking out of their pocket. It's about growing the pie for everybody.
yeah, and, one thing we've been talking about since, COVID is, supply chain resilience. But you're talking,
Mhm.
and so, and one thing that Trump administration has tried to focus on strongly is, end to end, where, we control, a process from, the very beginning to the product, landing on someone's plate. And so what you're calling for something even broader than that, which is, a different diversification along the entire supply chain, and the U.S. to, uh, be thinking about that, holistically, and providing, incentives and dollars where necessary to actually do that. And so,
Yeah,
but
I think we need to be doing
but
that, right? We're looking at
and I
bailouts for farmers again, and we'd be better spending the money on investing.
yeah. Also, I mean, so you're talking about an investment route, which I'm all supportive, and, like, not picking winners or losers, creating incentive schemes, right? But also, wouldn't this also just be largely alleviated and bring competition back into the market by just, getting rid of the Moroccan and, Russian tariffs?
Can you get rid of all the tariffs? Sure, but I mean don't get me started on Russia. It's a whole different
Yeah,
topic.
okay. I'll make you talk
Yeah,
about it
on
next week.
Morocco, absolutely. Like you want to encourage domestic production. The tariffs have a limited utility when
Mm,
you want to facilitate a domestic industry. You saw it with U.S. steel industry in the 1870s, 1880s, right? Because the British would have just overwhelmed us if we didn't have some tariffs in place.
mhm.
Um, the broad-based tariffs are distortive to trade,
Yeah.
right?
It's about
Uh,
targeting to specific industries to be able to give our industries a fair shot.
yeah,
Right now, as you said, it's broad, and it's, these. Unfortunately, the when an issue raises to the level of the White House, then suddenly action can be taken. But, there's too many individual small, topics that need to be addressed, and, um, our industries are being left behind.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Any final thoughts before we take off for the day?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, thanks again. This has been Adam Cornish and
Paul Harrison,
for Agriculture Advocate. Thanks, everyone.
y'all take care.